So we finally have the patch notes in hand for Season 3, and I'll let you know what I initially thought as some cool interactions, some interesting buffs and nerfs. I've spent the past 6 hours on stream spiraling into madness, mostly asking the question, who is this for? What is this meant to do? And why do they hate Infinimist so much? It's not all doom and gloom. There's some good news here. And basically what I went through and did was I looked at every single change that could apply to the Necromancer, including just like generic items here like Paingorger, as well as new aspects. I also went and looked at the bug fixes, because some of those actually have like not really fully understood, but like very clear indications for like buffs to some of our builds. So I went line by line by line, and I broke down every conceivable interaction that we can currently think about that would lead to buffs, nerfs, or overall not really affecting the various builds that are currently in the game for the Necromancer. And then I wrote down generally what I think about them in the notes section over here. You'll see a couple times I wrote down, who is this for? Because I don't know who it's for, but we'll get to that in just a second. And then on top of that, I went and looked at the current tier lists for max roll, obviously ignoring Abattoir of Zero because that content doesn't exist anymore, and generally decided where I think the current builds on those tier lists are going to move. So whether or not they bump down from S tier or bump up to A tier, red with a little underscore means it went down, green with the arrow means it went up, however many underscores it has is how many times it went down, how many arrows it has is how many times it went up. So if you don't want to listen to me breaking down each one of these things as succinctly as I can, just go ahead and use the timestamps down below, skip to the particular change that you want a little bit more insight into, or just use this data sheet. I'll include it in the description as well. So you could just have it at your disposal as much as you want to take a look at the mad ramblings of somebody trying to figure out how every single build the Necromancer has is going to be impacted by every single change in the notes. Okay, cool. You can watch it however you want. Let's go through the list of changes. Again, I'm going to try to be fairly succinct here. I'm going to include breakdowns of what I think the logic is, like how it will literally work. Paingorger's Gauntlet here are a pretty cool little addition to the game. It basically says if you hit something with a non-basic cast skill, it's not like random effects, not your little pets doing stuff, not your Seneschal doing something, but in the instance of, let's say, Blood Surge, you hit the entire screen, those monsters get marked for 3 seconds. Then if you were to hit a marked enemy with a basic skill, the damage from that basic skill will be dealt to everything and it will be amplified. And the amount that's amplified is pretty decent. It's a 3 times multiplier with a perfect roll. Think about this like Overpower and Blood Lance. You spread Blood Lances all the way around, you hit another monster with it, and all the monsters that are currently lanced will take damage. It's very similar to that. In that same vein, I generally think that Paingorger gauntlets are basically going to be tested on every single build, but where it's really going to shine is very specifically on blood builds themselves. Bloodlance and Blood Surge both typically have to spam Hemorrhage to be able to get back their essence, so being able to amplify how much damage Hemorrhage is doing, while similarly acting in the same way that Bloodlance and Blood Surge do, which is hit everything on the entirety of the screen, probably going to be a really nice overall damage increase for density clearing. It's not going to do anything against single targets, but maybe that's okay. People are asking a lot of questions about like, well, what about this and then that and then this and that and this and that? Here's what I assume it is. If you hit any target with a use of a basic skill, the damage from that is what will echo out. You won't get any of the additional benefits. I don't think it will trigger multiple times across multiple enemies. So if I had 10 enemies in front of me, I hit them all with the corpse explosion, and then I use Reap to hit all 10 of them, I don't think you're going to get 100 instances of damage by it echoing off of each one of them. I think it will trigger once per activation of a basic skill. And until we see it in game, obviously we won't be able to test it, but that's what I'm working with right now and why I think that blood builds will be the best recipients of this item if you can find a way to drop off one of their offensive aspects, which is typically going to be pretty difficult. Aspect of Adaptability basically says, especially in the early game while leveling, getting resource is just going to be easier, and that generally just helps out every single build in the early game because it is in the early game where you have the hardest time managing your resources. But on top of that, if you are full on resources, you're going to gain additional damage on your basic skill use. And while this is absolutely going to be like a really powerful tool and kind of build around option for things like the Druid as well as the Barbarian, the Necromancer doesn't have that many great basic skills to really use with this. And I don't think you're going to see it like take Storm and like come up with some magic awesome basic skill build. That being said, there is a universe where if you put enough of these basic skill kind of components together and you make the ultimate Megazord, There is a universe where there is a basic skill build, which has kind of always been on the cusp of a reality for the Necromancer, depending on what season you're in. Juggernaut Aspect says you're going to gain a huge amount of flat armor, but your evade is going to have 100% increased cooldown. I don't really think that the Necromancer needs this. There is a universe where the Golem is going to gain more thorns damage from your armor, and people are going to do that. It's still going to be bad because your minions can't trigger Needle Flare, so you can't do AoE damage with your thorns, but like, people are going to do it. And also, I had a lot of people in chat saying like, oh, I'll just use the attacks reduce cooldown for my evade. Keep in mind, to be able to evade one more time, you typically have to do 3 attack animations, and doubling that means you're going to have to do 5 to 6 attack animations. So having to do 6 separate skill inputs before I can evade again is just kind of a no-go on the Necromancer, who desperately needs to use evade to actually have any form of mobility, especially now that Metamorphosis is gone. Ring of Starless Skies, just insane. Going to be insane on every single build that uses Essence, and also is going to be a good option for builds that don't use Essence. So you'll see here that I have Starless Skies kind of across the board except for Bone Spirit, which can't typically spam a lot of skills. But you might be saying like, well, Mac, what about like Infinimist or Minions? How are they ever going to like benefit from this? Keep this in mind. Starless Skies says that every time that you spend Essence, you're going to gain a 10% damage multiplier for 3 seconds, stacking up to 40%. So this ring, which already says crit chance, lucky hit chance, and crit damage, also now says 40% damage multiplier, which is just strictly stronger than Conceited Aspect, strictly stronger than Inner Calm Aspect, a lot of these like cheesier things that we typically use to boost our damage. And the skill Decrepify cost Essence. So just by applying Decrepify in the natural way that you do, you will have a damage multiplier. So if you're not using X-Falls on Infinimist, let's say you're doing the Black River variant of it, you just have a new 40% damage multiplier, and people are running double curse and getting almost nothing out of Iron Maiden to effectively get this bonus. So this might be pretty nasty, even on builds that typically don't spend Essence in major ways. Melted Heart of Selig actually has good stats now, basically doubled the all stats, tripled the healthy, so it's going to say 100% additive damage, and now it's going to have movement speed as opposed to core skill damage. Okay, cool. Sadly, the amulet isn't going to somehow eclipse losing out on a 50% damage bonus to one of your most important damage aspects on your build. And they also nerfed the actual ability to go infinite and immortal with the amulet itself, since it will no longer block 100% of incoming damage. Now, people have been asking, what about Bone Spirit? Basically, if you were to take the increased damage from Bone Spirit, which is going to be 240%, which is roughly a 26% damage boost on top of the normal Essence damage multiplier that you have, and then compare that up against what losing out on 50% bonus on Serration looks like, the math doesn't play out to actually make Bone Spirit do more damage. It sounds really big, but if you sit down and do the math, it doesn't get there. The Overpower Nerfs, they are going to be basically reducing your additive overpower damage on builds that care about that from anywhere between like 200 to 400% additive damage when you end up doing the math. And that's ignoring the fact that we're actually all going to gain a huge amount of additional maximum life, because maximum life previously used to take the flat bonuses from your gear, like 1300 on your armor and 1300 on your ring, and just add that on top of your life after it already did any multiplication that it would do. But now it's going to take your base life, this additive life, and then multiply it. So we're going to get a huge amount of this back just because of the fact that our health is going to go up. And because of that, our fortified status is going to have a larger value as well. So while a lot of people see this and they're like, oh snap, overpower builds are absolutely dead, it's really not. It's not that impactful at all. It is going to hurt a little bit in the early game because you're not going to get as much free overpower damage. But I think it's all going to wash out in the end. But it isn't cool that Necromancers are being nerfed just because Druids and Barbarians can actually scale overpower damage in ways that matter and are too powerful. I think it's the skills that are the problem. Oh, and the fact that the Barbarian gets to just use 3 additional weapons, 2 of which are 2-handers, but like, we'll just keep ignoring that in Diablo 4, and we'll definitely be able to balance around it. Okay, on to the Necromancer changes that are specific. Mutilator Plate makes you ask a lot of questions. This is going to be an armor for the Necromancer, and it's weird. It's a weird thing. But let me just break it down very simply. Basically, you are going to count as an enemy that is blood lanced. So the Bloodseekers aspect, which literally says number of lanced targets will increase how much damage you do to the primary. You will just gain an additional 25% damage there, which is like kind of cool. But it doesn't really change anything else. Anytime you cast Blood Lance and actually hit something, you will Fortify, which is great for blood builds. We want to be able to stack Fortify. And you have a chance to generate a Blood Orb, which is just generally nice. 5% is way too low. I think 10% would have like made a lot more sense, but like, hey, I'm not the developers. But then Bloodlance is also going to gain a 20% damage multiplier. So anything that we were losing from Overpower is already being vastly overperformed by this 20% damage increase. And until we see the stats, it's not like, oh my God, like this is going to be a godsend item. But even if all they had was like bare bones affixes that are like, okay, every single Bloodlance Necromancer is absolutely going to use this thing, and in general it is just a pretty nice little buff to it. Shattered Spirit is where we start to get into some pretty wild stuff. So let me explain to you what I think will happen when you use this aspect. You're going to cast Bone Spirit, and we're going to think about this like Magic the Gathering where there's a stack and effects have to happen in order. You cast Bone Spirit. To be able to cast Bone Spirit, it uses all of your essence. Upon casting Bone Spirit and draining all of your essence, 18 bone splinters will shoot out from the Necromancer themselves. These bone splinters should theoretically read your ranks in bone splinters, any modifiers that you have on bone splinters, and anything that would further multiply bone splinters as if you cast it yourself. They will then shoot out and deal damage to targets that they hit in like a circle around you, so they can still shotgun. I think in reality, like 3 or 4 of them will end up being eaten by the first monster. And then basically everything in front of you kind of won't get hit by stuff, but maybe monsters behind you will get hit by stuff. And then they will generate 6 essence per target hit. On top of that, they will deal increased damage. So up to a maximum of a 5 times multiplier. And then if you put this onto a 2-hander, up to a maximum of a 9 times multiplier. Now, here are some of the problems that I see with it that I think people kind of have like honeymoon eyes on for. 1, where are all of these monsters going to be when you use this skill? They're probably going to be corpse tendrils up in front of you because Bone Spirit has been and always will be a shotgun skill, meaning that theoretically all the monsters that you want to hit are directly in front of you. So the vast majority of splinters are not going to hit anything at all. What that basically means is that I think that you could assume to get anywhere between like 18 to 64 essence back, which is not nothing. It's pretty awesome. But people have been asking about, what about this with Paingorgers so I can get all these hyper multiples on my Bone Splinters damage? Remember that Bone Splinters does 12% damage at rank 5 because they're meant to shotgun into targets. These are not all going to shotgun into every single monster around you. And a 12% base weapon damage that isn't going to read you as having any essence on cast, because if we assume the order, it goes spend essence, cast Bone Spirit, on cast, trigger Bone Splinters. So you're going to miss out on your ossified essence. You're going to miss out on crit chance for them. You're theoretically going to miss out on Serration Aspect as well. Maybe. So the base damage is going to be kind of okay. You're going to multiply it by upwards of like 15 if you also use, Paingorgers. So we're doing 15 times a base of 12 per splinter, which is, again, not nothing. It is literally less than like even a rank 1 Bone Spear with the normal multipliers that it would have. But maybe that's really cool. Maybe I'm vastly underselling it. Just the fact that it's going to help to generate additional essence warrants being able to put this onto a ring where we were typically using pretty inefficient essence generation tools, because it turns out that like exposed flesh doesn't really work for your Bone Spirit typically, because it actually only triggers Lucky Hit 1 time on hit when you cast it into multiple targets. But maybe each Bone Splinters can trigger exposed flesh. And maybe this helps us to be able to generate essence when we're at low essence when we're casting Bone Spirit. There's a lot of what ifs here. I think people are going to use it. I don't think it's that crazy, but it is going to be the funniest looking thing on the planet. The other cool part about it is that I think if you use Blood Artisan's Cuirass to cast Bone Spirit for you, they will cast when you have this aspect as well, and then they will benefit from having your maximum essence, since that doesn't eat your essence. So it's a universe where Blood Artisan's Cuirass becomes the absolute de facto go-to for Bone Spirit builds, and this thing is just like a walking pipe bomb every 3 seconds triggering, and then at that point I think we're starting to get some pretty decent returns on it. Changes to Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden is still trash. Why? I'll help you get there. Iron Maiden does not trigger Hewed Flesh, and it doesn't trigger Abhorrent Decrepify. I have reported this bug to the developers because there's no reason why it shouldn't trigger these things. They are aware. Whether or not they ultimately call it a bug, or maybe it's supposed to work like that, which would be bananas, Iron Maiden is still going to be absolutely trash city. But they did increase how much damage it does, so people are going to beg me to use it, and I will inevitably make some kind of Thorns Minion build. I just don't think that's going to be good. Corpse Explosion Nerfs. First and foremost, let's just get past this part. The damage effectively doesn't matter. For key Infinimist builds like the X-Falls version, which I consider to be the standard, you literally don't care about the corpse explosion damage. For the Black River variant, we're talking about like a 12% reduction in damage on the base skill, which isn't great, but it's really not that bad, right? It's this lucky hit chance that makes me wonder, who did I piss off at Blizzard? Is it Adam Jackson? I thought we were friends, dude. I'm sorry. Whatever I said, I take it back, regardless of what it was and who I promised it would be true. I take it back. I was lying. Why? Literally why? Why did this have to happen? I don't know, but let's break it down mathematically so that you don't spiral as hard as I do. To understand the impact of this change to Corpse Explosion, the reduction in its lucky hit chance, which is a 37% reduction in your chance of proccing lucky hit, we have to look at the 3 key factors that go into an Infinimist build, and these can be applied to a variety of Darkness builds as well. Hewed Flesh, Abhorrent Decrepify, and X-Falls. Hewed Flesh is how we make our corpses, Abhorrent Decrepify is how we reduce our cooldowns, and X-Falls is how we do our damage. We are assuming, based off of old Corpse Explosion, these were the proc chances, using pretty high-end gear with lucky hit chance, but not maximizing how much lucky hit chance we could possibly have. So looking at a late endgame version of the Infinimist Necromancer, you would expect to have 63% plain lucky hit chance, and that would be across your gloves, your rings, your main hand, and your offhand. You would then have 24% lucky hit chance with barrier, and that would be coming from your helmet and your offhand as well. Altogether, that's an 87% bonus to your lucky hit chance. So if we take the equation, this would be the 40% lucky hit chance of Corpse Explosion, multiplied by 1 plus your bonus, multiplied by the chance of this thing typically proccing. So for Hewed Flesh, against a non-boss target, that's 12%. Against a boss target, it's 24%. We don't need to care about the difference there because it's just multiplied by 2 regardless. For Abhorrent Decrepify, it's a 15% chance to proc, and the X-Falls is a 50% chance to proc. So we assume to proc Hewed Flesh roughly 9% of the time, Abhorrent Decrepify over 11% of the time, and X-Falls over 37% of the time. Okay, cool, a lot of numbers, but I just want to show you the baseline. With the new equation for Corpse Explosion's lucky hit chance, we are now only expecting to proc Hewed Flesh a little bit over 5% of the time, Abhorrent Decrepify 7% of the time, and X-Falls only 23% of the time. If you then look at these numbers, you'll see that they are a 37% reduction in overall output from Corpse Explosion. Now, that's huge. Keep in mind, though, that Corpse Explosion isn't the only lucky hit chance proccing ability that we have. We have Blood Mist with Blood Soaked, we have Ultimate Shadow on our Bone Storm, we also have Blight, which is completely unaffected. So, and this is real napkin math here, I'm assuming that Corpse Explosion makes up about 70% of our total lucky hit proccing pool. It's definitely the vast majority, but it's not everything. In that regard, we're only losing a 26% overall efficiency of our build's engine. You can almost directly translate that to 26% reduction in damage because X-Falls is part of this engine. Technically, each one of these things needs to have different weights, right? So we can still probably manage Abhorrent Decrepify fine. X-Falls will see a bit of a reduction in overall proccability, but again, not everything was coming out of Corpse Explosion there. The biggest issue is when we come to corpses, and the inability to generate corpses at the proper rate to be able to move and play in the typical gameplay loop of Infinimist is going to be heavy. But there is hope. We could actually be putting more lucky hit chance onto our character than we were previously. So it's going to come in a couple different options here. First and foremost, we literally could just add on Soulbrand. I hate Soulbrand, but if Soulbrand is necessary to get my lucky hit chance back up, damn it, I will use it. Greaves of the Empty Tomb on the other side is actually just great piece of gear, and being able to put it all the way up gets us another 15% lucky hit chance. So that one's not too bad. That's not a hard pill to swallow. We do lose a little bit of mobility, but hey, we also gain back damage reduction. It's not a terrible piece of gear, and we use it quite often in a lot of different setups. So we could put that back onto the build as well. And lastly, we could get 9 more lucky hit chance with barrier from our amulet. That does mean that we'll have to drop damage reduction in some circumstances, a damage multiplier in some circumstances, but our amulet has always had some wiggle room, so it's not terrible. All in all, that gives us back 39% additional lucky hit chance. So let's go ahead and look at what those numbers will actually represent if we're willing to reprioritize 4 more lucky hit chance on the build. So with a base lucky hit chance of 126, total bonus. We bump back up to almost 7% chance to proc Hewed Flesh, over 8% chance to proc Abhorrent Decrepify, and over a 28% chance to proc X Falls, which again, if you put the weights on it of about 70% effectiveness, as far as it's negatively impacting our build, what we're actually only looking at is a 17% reduction in the build's output. And since Infinimist was an S tier build, a 17% overall nerf, if we're willing to actually adapt to the game and how it's now being played, isn't terrible. Blight sees a damage increase. Cool, just slightly better. Sever sees a damage increase. Cool, just slightly better. Bone Spirit sees a 1% damage increase. Well, kind of. It's 1% per essence. So let's say you had 200 essence before, you would have a 600% damage multiplier to your Bone Spirit damage. You will now have an 800% damage multiplier. That's a 33% increase in Bone Spirit damage, ignoring everything else. What that basically means is that you can actually get away with one-shotting monsters with less than a full orb of essence than you did previously. Where we were one-shotting with a 600% damage multiplier, eating all of our essence before, now we're only going to be at 66% of our total essence and still be able to output that same amount of damage. And that's bananas wild, and it's why most people are going to be trying Bone Spirit, and a lot of people are going to be hyping it up as just like an insanely powerful build. I definitely think it's better. I don't think it's all of a sudden S tier, but I personally will be playing it because it gave it so many toys that are going to make piloting it feel really good. Most notably, Dreadful Bone Spirit. It's going to go from giving you 30 essence back to, on average, somewhere around 60 to 75 essence back, which is definitely going to help with being able to cast your next Bone Spirit faster, and that's sick as well. Now we get into a bunch of changes that begged the question, who is this for? I'm not going to belabor every single point, but I'm going to go through why I don't understand them and why I think they're ultimately just kind of trash. Acolyte's Decompose used to say that you and your minions got a 10% damage multiplier when you were channeling. The 10% damage multiplier to your minions is pretty cool because typically they only get 30% of your bonuses. Now it says after you channel for 1.5 seconds, the enemy becomes vulnerable. Who is this for? The Necromancer, especially a shadow build, especially one with pets, can trigger Abhorrent Decrepify on corpse tendrils and have permanent uptime on vulnerability. So we lost a damage multiplier and we gained a redundancy on a system that we already have 100% uptime on. Who is this for? Initiate's Decompose used to just say it slows enemies. Now it says slows enemies, and if you channel it for 1.5 seconds, you gain a movement speed boost for 5 seconds. Who is this for? Shadow Necromancers can already reach 190% movement speed, with movement speed on their boots, on their amulet with Reaper's Pursuit, and then Ghostwalker on their boots as well. So it's not actually a 30% increase in movement speed in the endgame, it's only a 10% increase. And you had to stop moving for 1.5 seconds, whereas Reaper's Pursuit says just doing shadow damage at all gets you a 15% movement speed multiplier, so you can continue running. On top of that, who is running for 5 uninterrupted seconds in a dungeon? Nobody. So you're probably only getting a speed boost for 5 minus the 1.5 for channeling is 3.5, and then minus the 1 second that you're not actually going to be running for. So you're gaining a 10% movement speed boost for 2.5 seconds. Who is this for? In leveling, it might help out a lot, but Decompose as a tool actually generates twice the essence if you spam cast it, which makes it significantly better for leveling than actually channeling it. And actually channeling it is what you need to do to actually get this movement speed boost. So I repeat, who is this for? I don't know. Dreadful Blood Mist. It used to say you can fortify for maximum life on builds that can't typically get fortify and somehow don't care about the corpses, but now says gain 10% crit chance after Blood Mist ends. Here's my question. Who is this for? Blood Mist, on any build that uses it proactively, wants the corpses because you cast corpse tendrils on the corpse when you get out of Blood Mist so that you can CC everything, apply vulnerable, and then blow everything away. So I'm never not going to use the corpse version. But let's say you are going to use it to be able to gain crit chance. The only builds that actually care about getting crit chance are ones that can't typically get it themselves. That would be the Blood builds and the Darkness builds, since both Bone Spirit and Bone Spear can reach 100% chance to crit without this bonus. What does that mean? Blood builds lost a cool Fortify tool in the use of Blood Mist, but Blood builds use the corpses. Why? Because they want to cast corpse tendrils so that they can apply all of their damage, which is really finicky, into as tightly knit and overlapping group as possible to maximize its output. Similarly, Darkness builds need the corpses. Why? Because we want to cast Corpse Explosion, we want to cast Corpse Tendrils, so all the monsters are in one area so that all of our overlapping damage over time abilities will all hit all of them. So I beg the question, who is this for? I don't know. Someone did point out that since our Seneschal companion will gain 100% of our crit chance, this will give them 10% crit chance. That's all I got. Moving on. Bone Prison, at first, begged the question, who is this for? And then I worked through it, and there are some cool utilizations here. And actually, the Bone Prison package might be necessary to make things like Infinimist go back to working properly. Bone Prison now lets you freely move through it, something that I absolutely need to do in the beginning, and I love that so much. Also, the enhancement, which is the one that used to give you essence, is now going to apply vulnerable. So you don't have to put in 3 points to be able to get a cool vulnerable tool for builds like Blood Artisan's Cuirass on Bone Spirit that uses corpse tendrils to generate blood orbs instead of vulnerability, and instead you would use Bone Prison. So that's already a really cool option there as well. They changed the Fortify option. Again, a cool non-blood build option for being able to generate Fortify on a build, and even pretty cool on blood builds as well. And they took that and they made it so that Bone Prison will reduce the cooldowns of your skills according to how many monsters are in it, up to a maximum of 3 seconds. So you need to hit 6 monsters to get the 3 seconds. Okay. What Bone Prison now says for builds is if you're willing to use the offensive aspect that says that Bone Prison casts Blight for you, and of the Void, which is a utility aspect that says that Bone Prison's Blight will now pull in monsters, Bone Prison now says a cool obstruction which will help you to interrupt monsters and gain survivability that applies vulnerable for you, and is a good lucky hit chance tool since Blight's lucky hit chance is completely unaffected. That also will apply a damage multiplier for you. That will also trap everything and basically CC them for you. That's actually pretty rad. And I think that the Bone Prison package will see a lot of use across a multitude of different builds that are looking to shore up the issues that the reduction in lucky hit chance from Corpse Explosion put on the majority of builds. Also, remember, Bone Prison, for whatever reason, triggers Bone Graft for the Bone Spirit Necromancer, and is one of the only ways to consistently have that buff up 100% of the time to do the most damage possible. So Bone Prison's going to see some use, myself included. Book of the Dead changes here. They are cool. They're actually like pretty neato-skeeto. Basically, golems are going to be less stupid. Before, if you use the activated ability of a golem, it would try to run back to whatever its target used to be, and instead now it will retarget a monster within the area that it went to, meaning that it will more proactively be able to be targeted in battle and be able to be used. On top of that, golems are going to gain the ability to cleave. Only bone golems could before, now all of them can. And your bone golem's going to gain a ton of thorns based off of your armor value when it taunts, making it better. Ultimately, I don't think that these changes are going to somehow make golems like insanely powerful or good or anything better than just a leveling tool in the early game for the Necromancer, but it does make the AI better. That is pretty rad, and they do have an additional buff later on, which says that their Paragon Glyph is going to go from giving them additional health, which in the end game it really didn't need, but in the early game and for builds that don't invest in it was actually like kind of important, to increase its damage output. That's not even strictly like a nerf or a buff, it's just different, and it really depends on whether or not they'll be able to survive on weaker gear, whereas typically that additional health was actually pretty nice for them. Cult Leader. Oh boy, Cult Leader. Cult Leader, a lot of people had a lot of opinions about Cult Leader. Let me just show you what I wrote down for Cult Leader so that you can get a better grip of how I personally feel about it. Cult Leader is currently listed as a nerf in my sheet. And you may go, Mac, that's insane. How is that a nerf? Let me walk you through it. They're going to gain additional damage based off of how much maximum attack speed bonus they have. Not you, the Necromancer, how much they have. A lot of the different attack speed bonuses that the Necromancer have is either tied to Unyielding Commander, which forces you to use Army of the Dead, which is the worst ultimate skill in the game, or a bunch of ramping mechanics. Kalan's Edict says you can't be attacked within the past 2 seconds, which is just insane. I don't understand how that still exists in the game. Inspiring Leader says that you have to maintain healthy status. The aspect that has them gain additional attack speed over time ramps over a 3-second period and then typically drops off between combats. So, whereas before they had a static 45% damage multiplier 100% of the time, no matter what, and even if you only had one of them out, you just had a 15% damage multiplier no matter what. Now, the Kalan's Edict, which is tenuous at best, Inspiring Leader, which is pretty easy to maintain, and then the ramping attack speed that they get means that actually to start off, even with attack speed across all of your gear, you have less than a 45% total damage multiplier to start. And then when it ramps up, you get up to somewhere around like 65% damage multiplier. So that is higher. Don't get it twisted. That is higher. But it starts off lower, it ramps up to higher, and that needs Kalan's Edict and Inspiring Leader to have 100% uptime and their attack speed boost to have 100% uptime, which just isn't real and doesn't happen in actual game scenarios. Now let's talk about Inspiring Leader. Inspiring Leader, again, will give you a huge amount of attack speed. It basically handles their attack speed cap for you. You actually don't have to do anything else. And in that regard, you'd get all the way up to 100% damage multiplier. But you have to use Army of the Dead, a skill that's terrible, that doesn't give you survivability, that doesn't give your minions crit chance, that doesn't give you damage reduction in barrier, and doesn't apply a bunch of damage over time effects from Bone Storm, which is what you would typically use. I see this as a nerf, because not only does it disenfranchise early game leveling, where you don't have all of these minion attack speed stats on your character natively, and you used to just have 45% damage multiplier just for clicking the Paragon node. Now you have to have a bunch of gear to get the full benefit out of it. You actually have to use one offensive aspect and an ultimate skill that are trash. And the net benefit without using those things is only about like a 40% increase to the damage here when it's more tenuous and nebulous. I don't get it. I sincerely don't get it. For the top end, like end game Necromancer, yes, you will probably be able to manage that pretty okay. But in every other scenario, it's trash. So there you go. That's how I feel about Cult Leader. I don't understand why it needed to change. They could have just buffed how much it gave to you. Here's the last thing, though. It does open up a world where you use the Cult Leader Paragon node without having 3 minion types up. I don't think that's real. I don't think you would build into the Cult Leader board if that was real. But maybe in the future, there's a reason to do that. And at that point, in that future season, when we have another balance change, I guess I'll eat my words. Swelling Curse is the actual reason why you should be playing Bone Spirit at this point in Season 3. This aspect says that you just have 25% crit chance. You could put it on an amulet, you could put it on a two-hander. I don't think that you do. I don't think that you need more than 25% chance to crit here, but you can if you're leveling. And every time that you hit a target with Bone Spirit, you increase your maximum essence for 15 seconds. By 2 per target. So if you have 10 targets, that gains you 20 maximum essence for 15 seconds. That's a 60% damage increase on just the base skill. That's an additional 30% increase from your key passive. It helps to make it so that the serration aspect is going to be topped out in the maximum amount of damage bonus that you can get there. It gets you additional crit chance as well. And most notably, it also allows you to gain additional maximum essence on a Bone Spear Necromancer. So I think that there's a universe where there's going to be a hybrid Bone Spear, Bone Spirit Necro. Walking into Season 3, Bone Spirit for single target damage, Bone Spear for everything else. You just cast Bone Spirit to get a huge boost on it, and then you're basically able to get the best of both worlds. But this 25% chance to crit basically means you don't need anything from your skill tree, and you can forego crit on your gear, and you don't need to run Grasping Veins on a two-hander, opening up the build design of Bone Spirit as well. This aspect is absolutely nutso bananas crazy, and I'm so excited that they added something like this, because the original Swelling Curse was actually the worst aspect in the game, and that's including hulking, which I'll get to in a second. Torturous Aspect. Cool concept here. And if they change the Iron Maiden damage to be able to trigger Hued Flesh and Abhorrent Decrepify, I think we have something on our hands. It's going to change it into a darkness skill. The skill is going to deal shadow damage, and then it's going to stop itself from applying to targets. Let me walk you through this. The funniest part about Torturous Aspect, the thing that I've been giving feedback on since the game came out and even beforehand, is that Torturous Aspect is desynergistic with Iron Maiden itself. Iron Maiden needs the targets to attack you to trigger the damage. Torturous Aspect says the monsters are stunned. You see the problem here. A stunned monster cannot attack you. A stunned monster cannot deal damage to itself. A stunned monster doesn't care that it's now doing shadow damage to itself because it's stunned. It's wild. It's wild bananas to me. But let's talk about the implications, because it's not nearly as strong as you might think that it is, but it is cool. It becoming a darkness skill means that it can trigger Reaper's Pursuit. It can trigger Stun from Crippling Darkness, further stopping it from being able to deal damage. But now it will scale off of shadow damage on your gear, as well as Gloom and Terror passives in your skill tree. And then on top of that, be able to trigger Shadow Blight, not only for its damage, but also be able to trigger the Blighted aspect. So it's not completely trash. It has a use case. I'm not sure where you will fit an additional utility aspect onto most of the darkness builds, because Blight wants the Void on its helmet, most people want Explosive Mist, most people want mobility on their boots, and most people are using Howl from Below or an offensive aspect on their gloves themselves. On top of that, we now definitely need Blood-Soaked and Ultimate Shadow to actually be able to trigger enough lucky hit chance. So Torturous is in a really weird place. If they make it so that Iron Maiden's damage is better, can actually crit, which it also can't crit. I forgot about that. It can't crit. It doesn't trigger Abhorrent Decrepify. It doesn't trigger Hued Flesh. So if they change those 3 things about it, Now Torturous is a cool tool for being able to maintain maximum uptime on all of your buffs, as well as potentially increase damage for minion builds most notably, or just be a cool new tool for Blighted, Aspect, and Shadow Blight on targets for Infinimist or other darkness builds. Rotting Aspect will now say 100% of the time when your Decompose triggers a corpse on a target, it will make another corpse. Pretty cool. And then Hulking. They doubled Hulking's effects, a 100% increase to all of their abilities. What does Hulking say? Hulking says now your golem has a 10% chance to reduce its active cooldown by 2 seconds and a 5% chance to spawn a corpse each time it damages an enemy with its normal attack. So now that every golem can cleave, they'll hit multiple targets with these effects. You might say, hey, that's pretty rad. Don't we have corpse issues? This will probably be sick. Let me just run you through the very quick stats of it. Let's say there were 10 monsters in front of me. No, you know what? Let's say there's 20 monsters in front of me. A 5% chance to generate a corpse is a 1 in 20. So 1 out of 20 times you would expect it to occur. Now, if you actually looked at stats, what it basically says is that if you were to hit 20 targets with a 1 in 20 chance of it happening, 63 or 65% of the time, you would expect for it to trigger once. Cleaving through 20 monsters, you would expect to generate 1 corpse about 2/3 of the time. That's nothing. That's nothing at all. The 10% chance to reduce its cooldown is double that, right? So you would expect to reduce its cooldown twice by 2 seconds by hitting 20 enemies in front of you. The issue being that any good summoner build is able to immediately reduce the golem's cooldown via Abhorrent Decrepify, because your monster's thorns damage, when all the monsters are hitting them, triggers Abhorrent Decrepify. So golem skills are being spammed every single second on a summoner build, so the golem doing it themselves is effectively moot. And then on top of that, every time that they're using one of their special abilities, they're running and doing an activation and not doing their basic attack, which even further reduces how often they are theoretically reducing the cooldown of their activations. This thing could say a 50% chance to generate a corpse when it hits a target. And then I think we're in an area where maybe a build that otherwise wouldn't use a golem has a chance to do it. And then maybe it's kind of cool. Until we get to like pretty ridiculous numbers, the math just doesn't math here. But yeah, that's it for the balance patch. I think there are some cool things to look forward to. I think it's finally awesome that like Bone Spirit's going to get its day to shine in the spotlight. And I hope that it wildly overperforms everything that I could possibly think of. I think that there are some like dark horse potential, like weird meta shifting things with some of the changes, most notably the unique items here. And there is a universe where I'm like underestimating the total impact of the robot, although I think it should kind of generally impact every build seemingly the same. Chat member did point out, which is very intelligent to notice, that overpower builds really can't scale their pets damage because we can't make the pets overpower. And that is something to take note of. We can scale their crit chance and their crit damage, so being able to build them on a full crit build already, probably going to be pretty impactful. That being said, not every single robot just has to do damage for you. Some of them could just lend you utility, and maybe overpower builds end up just needing the utility because they already have enough damage, multiplication. At least the developers sure think that they do. So that part's going to be hard to see. But as always, let me know down in the comments what you're thinking. Do you think I undervalued anything? Did I overvalue anything else? Remember that you're going to be able to go look at all of my notes, so you can go pick my brain on why I think these changes are what they are, so you don't really have to guess. You don't have to go back and watch the entirety of the video. You can just use this sheet. It'll be linked down below. Let me know what you think. What are you feeling? What builds are you excited to try? What are you upset about? What are we hopefully going to see in a mid-season balance change? Are you looking forward to the Gauntlet? I think it's going to be absolutely phenomenal, but I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you're brand new here and you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out immensely. We're just about to hit 40,000 subscribers, which is insane. I never thought that we'd ever get here in my content creation career. I will be completely honest with you, and it's vastly humbling to figure out that even like more than 10 people want to come hang out and listen to me ramble on about a video game. But thank you all so much. If you wouldn't mind leaving a like on the video as well, that is a huge way of telling YouTube that like, hey, this was good, I want to see more of it. But that's enough of me shilling. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in season 3.